Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm delighted to be speaking with Adam Miles and Rob Walter. Gents, welcome.
Thanks for having us, Dan.
Cheers, Dan. Thank you.
So excited to be talking with you both, a sports psychologist and a cricket coach, working together on mental skills. So this is heaven for me. I'm going to enjoy unpacking what you've both been working on. But to get us started, let's do some introductions. I mean, for you, Adam, this is a return visit we spoke about. We were talking off air, was it about 4 or 5 years ago? So it's great to have you back on. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Adam, and tell us about your work.
Yeah, thanks again for having us on, Dan. So I'm Adam Miles, originally from Wiltshire in England. I've been out here in New Zealand, so I'm calling in from Southland, Winton, where I live with my wife and 2 children, Madeline, Elena and Elsie. And I've been here for about 10 years now, and that's how I've got to know Rob, up until recently, and until we sort of parted ways from Otago. But since I last spoke to you, and I guess leading up to that point, I've been involved in psychology and sports psychology, working through a master's and PhD. Master's in out at Cardiff Met, and then coming over to New Zealand or Dunedin for my PhD. Worked with Ken Hodge there, looking at some athlete transition, mental health, life skill development work. I then went on to do some coaching. When I last spoke with you, I was working at Otago Cricket as the head of the pathway there, working with the academy and age group teams, and having a little bit to do with the Otago Volts, so the men's flagship team, domestic team. And then following that conversation reasonably swiftly, whilst Rob was working as head coach, I moved into the assistant coach role. Which has given us an opportunity to meet with you today, albeit 4 or 5 years later, and talk about some of the work we did. Currently, I am working as a psychologist in primary care 3 days a week, so that's with mild to moderate mental health conditions and some physical health behaviour change stuff. And then I have a couple of days a week working in sport, so still working with Otago Cricket, but as a team psychologist, as well as the Southern Steel, which is a netball team here based in the south of New Zealand. So I'm very much a full-time practitioner now. I moved away from my academic sort of background, although it does stand me in good stead from time to time.
A busy man, Adam, and that Kiwi accent is developing, mate. It really is. That Wiltshire accent has disappeared or is disappearing.
I'm sure a few people back home will have a few things to say. So thanks for pointing that out, Dan.
I think the other thing that has changed in the last 5 years is the quality of the technology. I seem to remember we had an absolute disaster. I think we had to bin one recording or something from what I remember. So you sound crystal clear today in your wonderful Kiwi accent. So that's brilliant. And Rob, coming to you, great to see you, great to meet you. Excited to talk to you today. Rob, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your work.
Well, firstly, I've got a lot less letters behind my name than Adam Miles has, so let's just clear that up. My degree is in human movement sciences, so I was originally a strength and conditioning coach for a professional cricket side in South Africa, and then with the Proteas for 4 years as their strength and conditioning originally. I did 7 years of IPL at the same time, also in the fitness and fielding space. So kind of was always coaching, but trying to dabble in both really. I was very passionate about cricket and coaching, less passionate about strength and conditioning, but was probably able to bring them together in a manner that made sense to a few people. So managed to get a couple of jobs along the way. Certainly, I work with the strength and conditioning guys, obviously at different teams now, and they know far more than I did when I was doing the job. So I'm glad I've moved on from that. Coached. I was a head coach of the Titans in South Africa for 3 years, and then moved to Dunedin, which was you couldn't get more polar opposite Pretoria in South Africa to Dunedin in New Zealand. So we packed up and moved for me to be the head coach of Otago, which I did for 5 seasons, and then moved on to Central Districts, which was on the North Island move, so a lot warmer and a bit more pleasant than Dunedin can be at times. It's a pretty brutal place if the southerly starts to blow. So much to the joy of my wife, we moved to somewhere warmer. And I did that job for just short of 2 seasons before being appointed as the white ball coach for the South African side men's team. So kind of a full circle, really. Started there with the side as a strength and conditioning coach, and very privileged now to be the head coach of that white ball team.
I'm interested in this, Rob, because you said, I mean, do you have a background in playing cricket? How I'm interested in the dynamic between being a strength and conditioning coach, or starting in that way and moving on to coaching cricket. So do you have a background in playing cricket, or just you had a passion for cricket?
I thought I was a lot better than I was, that's for sure. But no, I played. I played at provincial B level.
Okay.
I was trying to actually. I went to after school, went away and studied human movements, and started to try and take the playing side a bit more seriously for a couple of years. Unfortunately, much like anywhere, when you sort of in the B section, there's certainly no financial support at that point in time, and I didn't have anyone supporting me financially, and the job for strength and conditioning of the side that I was actually trying to make as a cricketer came up. And so, whilst it was a tough decision, it was actually quite easy. I suppose we look back on decisions in our lives, and that whole sliding doors theory, what things might have looked differently, but here I am today, doing what I love and dreamt of doing, purely based on the decision to stop playing cricket and become a strength and conditioning coach. So.
I think we have those sliding doors moments every day. When you reflect back, another thing I'm interested in here, you did a degree in human movement at that time, and it sounds to me that you were still dabbling in your cricket. Did you feel, when you reflect back, did your studies in human movement positively impact your ability to play cricket? Or did you get to the point where there was an element of overthinking things? Or did you just try to keep them separate?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I was the world's greatest scholar, to be fair. In the university that I went to, I was promoted drinking more than I did studying, I think. Um, but no, I mean, in all seriousness, if I think back on it, there was some potential crossover, but I probably didn't think about it deeply enough to really understand how one impacted the other. Um, I think what I was always able to do is understand how human movements and the study of it could impact cricket, just in terms of the conditioning space. So just being able to link the two, like how to improve performance with the background of S&C, and potentially that's what allowed me to move into the job the way that I did, because I was able to link the two. And I think very often, if I look at some strength and conditioning coaches, they're very well studied and understand the science very well, but the practical application is where they trip up. I was probably less studied, but understood the practicalities and the application of the science a little bit better and more easily, and was able to convey it. So maybe that's where I had an edge, I guess.
Before we move on to unpacking the beginnings of your relationship, just a few definitional things, just for those listening in. You were S&C coach, Rob, in the IPL, so that's the Indian Premier League cricket. Proteas team, so that's the men's South African national team. Can you define, you're now the white ball coach for South African team. What is white ball?
So that's 50 over and T20 formats. Obviously, the cricket is split into 3 formats. So the Test match cricket, which is red ball, and then white ball, which is 50 over and T20.
We have a global audience, many of whom are passionate about cricket, and some of whom that kind of language would be unfamiliar. Coming to your relationship, I mean, coming to you, Adam, when did you meet Rob? I'm assuming it was related to Otago cricket. Take us back to day one, and maybe even the first couple of weeks. How did things start between you two?
Well, I guess I was still, if I remember rightly, Rob, I may have even been still playing A cricket when you first came across, or recently just finished. So I had some involvement with Otago cricket. I played a couple of first class games, and was playing mainly in their A team or their second team. as well as pursuing my PhD and doing some coaching in the age group section for Otago Cricket as well. So I was sort of more around the place. So it must have been actually.
Just to add something in there, I remember the first time that I saw Adam, they brought him in as a pace setter for the 1500 fitness test for the cricketers. So, he was the front man that everyone was chasing down to try and pass the test. So it was nice to have him. He's an athlete. He's a nice runner.
That's impressive,
man, but he's a nice runner.
That's impressive, Adam. Did you use psychological skills for the perception of pain there whilst you're running?
I guess so, perhaps. I think I was probably. I'm glad you placed me actually there, Rob, because it must have been the season following finishing playing cricket. I was involved in coaching, and the lads had called me back to run the 1500. So I whipped myself around the course there, and hopefully dragged a few of the lads along with me. But yeah, I mean, from the outset, I guess what I learned about Rob is he was very, very people focused, and in terms of getting to know his personnel, the people around him, whether it was the players, his immediate coaching team, or even those coaches working in what would have been the pathway then, was curious and interested in who we were and what we knew, and from there, I guess our relationship progressed over that 4 or 5 year period of Rob being head coach to me then working in the pathway as the pathway manager, having a lot of conversations around philosophically, what do we want to develop in our younger players? What types of skill sets are we looking for? How are we going to develop them from a mental skills perspective? So there was some continuity and alignment between what we were doing with our under 19s and our A teams in developing those players towards the Otago Volts or the first team. And then getting to work alongside Rob as assistant coach. And I guess in starting our discussion, Dan, there was a piece of work where I guess I was beginning to think more psychologically. As I just finished my PhD, Rob had always been thinking that way, and we had a great opportunity to begin to put a bit of a model together that we could really integrate and embed into the Otago Volts environment.
Can you just tell us a little bit about the Otago Volts, Adam?
Yeah, so we've got the Black Caps, which are the men's national team, which is similar to the, I guess, South Africa, who Rob's now coaching in the white ball formats. And then you've got Otago Volts, are one of 6 regional teams that are the professional sides. And I guess if you're growing up aspiring to play cricket in New Zealand, depending on which region you fall into, would depend on which team you play for. If you're in the south, that would be the Otago Volts.
Coming over to you, Rob, Adam said something really interesting there, that you, from the outset, he experienced you as being really people-focused as a coach. And I think that's interesting given your background, strength and conditioning coach, human movement, having played cricket. Why were you people focused? Because so many coaches, I'm not suggesting for 1 second many coaches aren't passionate about the psychology of the human being, but so many coaches are so centered on their sport, the mechanics of their sport, the tactical, strategical side of their sport, and coming from human movement. It surprises me that you were so oriented towards being people focused. Can you tell me a little bit about why that was an underpinning philosophy for you?
I mean, to be honest, I actually think it goes back a lot further than that, and just the way I grew up. So I went to boarding school at aged 8, and boarding school is really just all about relationships. I have some of the best friendships that are still very close to me that we developed in boarding school, and much like the Spud movies and all that sort of stuff. It was a great, it was a great experience for me. I loved it. I used to actually not look forward to going home on holidays because I'd just be on my own. So I think it's always starting back then. It was being close to people and interacting with people and developing relationships. Was what you did. It was just part of life. And in many ways, when you're starting out and your parents are leaving you at age 8 and driving out the gate, relationships are all you had. It's the thing that kept you safe. So I suppose to think deeply about it, I developed a lot of safety in developing relationships and having strong relationships with the people around me, which were not my family, but my boarding school mates were my family in essence. So, and then went away to university and very much had the same experience, just a really close group of friends who I lent on a lot at that time. So, maybe without thinking too deeply about it, maybe that's where the people focused orientation of the way I work comes from. But I've always just had a leaning towards connecting with people, and trying to lean into the connection to develop some motivation or be able to motivate. I always say that I think our connections with people is like, that's the laneway to influence. So the stronger the connection, the more lanes your highway's got. If the connection's weak, you're just a single lane through the back country. But if you've got a real strong connection, you're one of those mega highways. And there's a large opportunity for influence, and so that's really always been me, I guess. And I suppose if I had to think of a strength, that would be it.
I really like that equation and that analogy. Connection drives motivation, and the more connections you have, the more lanes of connections that you have, potentially the stronger you can motivate somebody, or the more potential you have to motivate somebody. Just staying with you here, Rob, I know that when you joined up with Adam at Otago, Adam had a playing background and he was coaching. However, the sports psychology within his coaching practice was emerging, given that he was doing or just completed a PhD. What experience had you had with sports psychology or sports psychologists previous to Adam?
Well, I mean, I suppose being with the South African side as S&C beforehand, we had a performance coach, Paddy Upton.
Yep, I know
So
Paddy.
and prior to Paddy, Jeremy Snape. So it was a great opportunity to experience the two of them, very different in their work, but two people who I got on really well with and really enjoyed the way they operated. And then along the way at various academies, just experiencing sports psychology. I suppose the one thing that I'd always experienced is, if you ask a cricketer, it's probably the same with lots of sports, but if you ask a cricketer, when you talk about performance and maybe the lack of or making an error, how much of your error is technical, how much of your error is in the space of being outskilled by your opponent, and how much of it is actually in your head, like an error that you've made psychologically or mentally. And that number would vary from 70 to 95%. Yet the makeup of support teams was always full-time specialist coaches and then part-time sports psychologists or performance coaches. So other than with the national team. So for me, that balance was always off. And so I suppose the head coach then becomes a performance coach in his own work, because a lot of it rests with him, and you don't have the specialist. So just to lead on to the relationship with Adam, is, for me, I saw an opportunity there for us where we had someone who was highly skilled in his field and was able to come on as my assistant, and we could really delve into that space together.
No pressure on you, Adam, with you being 70 to 95% of the equation in performance there. And taking those figures, Adam, and thinking about what Rob just said there around, well, if I don't have a specialist in place, and many teams at all levels don't, and so subsequently the coaches are the sports psychs in many respects, or deliver on psychology. The reality is, though, I mean, I'd love to get your comment on this, Adam, and I don't know if I'll formulate a question, but for me, coaches are in a great position, or even the best position, to deliver on psychology, even though you might be in the mix on the coaching team. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess it's something I've heard both you and your guests say a lot in the past. If psychology can be delivered through the coaching team, and the coaches have got some knowledge, or perhaps someone they can lean on to enhance their knowledge and way of delivering psychology, they're the best placed person. They're the person with the most contact with the players. So it's very much in their interest to understand that space. And if they can't have someone in their environment full time, to be either upskilling themselves or have someone that they're regularly working with to be able to develop the psychological attributes of their players. And I guess that's something that I've continued to really think about in setting out proposals when I work with different teams, is that, yes, I can work one-to-one with players, but actually, if you can build a really good relationship with the head coach, if you can thread the psychological work into their campaign plans, as we might call it in cricket, then it's got a better chance of bedding in and a better chance of the players growing and developing.
So it's an all-in integrated feel, and when you both got together, I'd love to put more meat on the bone in terms of the Otago Volts plan, the psychological plan. Staying with you, Adam, when you both got together and started to think about what this could look like. I mean, you've mentioned a few things already, but can we dive into this plan? Talk to me a little bit about the psychology of the Otago Volts, how you went about planning mental skills, psychological support.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing we thought about is sort of what had been before, and was there any common sort of terminology, language, concepts that the playing group had already become familiar with? And the thriving and surviving. So if you think about some of the challenge and threat states work, I know you've had multiple guests talk about that concept, that framework of looking at how we respond to stress and whether we're going to respond to it in a facilitative or beneficial perhaps way, or more of a debilitating way. So that had already been used by the previous mental skills trainer who had worked with the group for a number of years. And so that was our touchstone. So what do these guys already understand? And then we sort of work back into, well, if we're going to help them thrive more often, what do they need to know? And I very much borrowed from a stress response model, which was cognitive motivational relational theory, which is Lazarus and Folkman's work, which underpins a lot of the challenge and threat states work that you've seen from Martin Turner and colleagues more recently. And it's in essence the short side of it is we're going to react to a situation based on the perceived demands and the resources that we have available. So I guess if we put that in purely sporting terms, if you've got a under 17 academy player being chucked into the first team and they're not quite ready, when they meet the pace of play, whether it's the skill levels of more mature players who have had 10 years of domestic or professional experience, the challenge is going to be high. And their resources are more likely to be low, I guess, with the odd exception who adapts and transitions really quickly. I guess then from a psychological perspective, there's also the perception of what am I going to face out there and am I up to it? So we use that model to really begin to think about, well, how can we use this model in a way that the players are going to get? And how can we begin to communicate this through the trainings that we do with them and when they're actually living it in the nets through the winter and as we move into the season. So that was the starting point in terms of, okay, we're going to come down to this idea of there's you and then there's the environment. So you are bringing some resources. The environment's going to chuck something at you. There's going to be an initial reaction to that. That could be a very sort of positive one, or one that, yep, I've got this. I'm calm, cool, composed, it's under control. Or it could be one of perhaps more anxiety, tension, apprehension, that sort of more of the emotions and sort of thought patterns you might associate with more of an avoidance state. So that reaction is going to come up. And then in that moment, if it isn't as you might like it, you've got a chance to respond. And that's the bit of work there where Rob and I, as coaches with a psychologically minded approach, began to think about what resources we could develop in our players to get them thriving more often. So for those guys who were reacting and we saw their skills breaking down, or they weren't showing up in a way that they knew they were capable of, or as sort of the best versions of themselves most often, there was an opportunity then to get into either some discussion-based work, or whilst we're working with them in the nets or on the side of the pitch, to begin to think about, well, what are some of the skills, attributes, strategies you might develop to thrive more often?
I'm interested to unpack this further, do a geeky deep dive, if you like, because I know so many listeners would like this to be brought alive for them in terms of how did you go about doing this? You've mentioned some discursive stuff, some basic introductions to players, but how did challenge and threat, and as you said, we've spoken about challenge and threat states on the Sports Psych Show often, and you've talked about those things that can mediate whether one experiences a challenge state or a threat state, that sense of confidence or that sense of being in control, or having a positive mindset, focusing on what one wants rather than on what one doesn't want. Those are the kind of mediators of challenge and threat. But how did you specifically introduce this to players? Was it in a room? Was it just over time, just casual conversations here and there? Adam, I'd like you to invite you to share how you introduce this to players, and feel free to bring Rob in for any examples that you can potentially give to us. I'll hand it over to you and facilitate here.
Yeah. Well, before I sort of dive in with the how it was delivered, and I'll lean on Rob a bit for this as well, it was actually part of a broader framework that Rob had largely developed in conjunction with myself in bouncing some ideas around. And there's a great model about the premise of the season and everything that led through the winter. And Rob, please chime in at the end of this if I'm off the mark here, was to take the team to the next level. And so when I hear that aloud, I say it aloud, I'm like, all of a sudden I'm getting excited about something. That we're going to take this team to a place that it hasn't been before, both collectively and individually. So, okay, there's something you can grab onto to start with. And then what set around that was the idea of progressing their skills. And cricket, whether it's batting, bowling, fielding, has multiple different skills you could talk about, whether it's bowling Yorkers or slower balls for bowlers, or whether it's sweeping or hitting over the top for batters, as some basic examples. So we could begin to talk about, okay, in terms of taking yourself to the next level, let's think about moving your skills towards expert level, whatever they might be based on the position or role you play. And then the other part of that was, well, yes, we're going to make your skills better through the winter, through the pre-season and in the season. But ultimately, cricket's about winning moments. So we've got to deliver these skills in the moment. So we've got a part of our off-season and our pre-season training program, we're talking about growing people's skills. And we've also got this thing where we're saying, well, we've got to deliver this in the middle if we're actually going to go to the next level. We've got to deliver when it matters. We've got to win the pivotal moments within the game. So what's the part that bridges the gap there? Well, that's thriving more often. That's being able to develop your skills in the winter when there's low pressure, when it's not match play, when it's not on TV. And then you've got to go do it when it matters. So what's the part? Well, that's the psychological part. And in discussing that, that's where there was some momentum around, okay, yeah, we can now enter into those discussions as they emerge in training. And there was also a setup, which I might lead Rob to speak to, in terms of setting up the overarching sort of framework.
Yeah, I think so. We had a symbol which was an arrow, and the part that preceded all of that was the team's values. So the values was the shaft of the arrow, and then the three things that Adam's talking about, which was expert level skills, developing expert level skills, winning the moment, and thriving. That was sort of the arrow, the head of the arrow, and the tip is the next level, right? So it's just like the symbolism of that our values are the thing that actually drives us forward. It's the basis of our performance. And then you've got these three things that sit in the really pointy end of performance, which is those three aspects. And if you get it right, then the arrow tip is the next level, So anyway, I don't know if the players experienced it, but that's how I sort of put it together and formulated it in my head. And so when it came to the actual practical, delivering of that model, I think for me it was doing two things. It's like, so we had our values, which are great. So what we did is, which was growth mindset, resilience, enjoyment, accountability, and team first. And so what we did was we assigned a week in our preseason for each of those values. And so we had growth mindset, for example, for the week. And what we did then was we introduced growth mindset for the week. And then we allowed the players to also design the week that would have challenges that would stimulate the idea of growth mindset and grow growth mindset. And then the coaches would obviously jump in there as well. And we did that over a 5-week period. And actually the idea to do that came from a player, which was awesome. And he said, why don't we dedicate a week this so we can actually bring the value to life? Otherwise, like you've had these conversations many times before, values, just words on a wall that mean nothing. But let's bring these to life for us, for the players, so that we're all understanding of what does it mean to have growth mindset if we start talking about it. So for me, that was a very, very cool experience of working through the layers of each of those values, so that then when we spoke about being great, it actually meant something to the team, and they could understand and reflect back on, hey, so resilience, just remember that we woke up at 5:30 in the morning in Dunedin in the winter, and we got into that indoor center, which was freezing cold, and we try to execute our skills in really abnormal and uncomfortable situation, and we did it. So there we built some resilience on that day, and that you can reflect on forever. So that was a practical representation of building a strength in values, and then drove behavior, because obviously values are nothing if they don't drive behavior. So and then it started to feed into our language. So now you're getting language standards and behaviors, and that's everything that you want in an environment ultimately. And then what we did was we introduced the concepts of winning the moment, and try to unpack how that would look and feel for the team, and what are the things again practically. Because what I've sort of found with I'm not going to say sports people, cricketers, or the people that I work with mostly, is that it's again this understanding of how do we actually apply this thing practically that's going to make us perform better. That is everything. The deep nitty gritty and a deep understanding of how it all works is probably not what they're after. They just want to understand how it's going to make me be better. So we took win the moment, and we said, okay, so in order to win the moment, what are the things that sit around winning the moment? It's like, it is almost cyclical. So you're presented with this moment, and then what do? You do your planning, then you look to execute, and then you sort of assess your performance or how you did, and you review it, and then the cycle continues. So and the more we could identify the moments in the game, then the better chance we had at actually winning those moments. So that was the one that we spoke about, and where we'd work on that. And then the next, we'd dedicate this idea of expert level skills. And it's very simply just saying everyone starts somewhere on this continuum, whether it be just with a single skill of a sweep, for instance. And if you want to learn how to play a sweep, you start down at executing at where a beginner would. And actually, the concept came again from one of our players who I knew was a gamer. And I asked him, what are the levels in gaming? Tell me what the levels in gaming are, so we can make this thing, maybe it speaks to a few of the players. And so he said, okay, well, let's go beginner, we go intermediate and professional, and then expert. And so we said, assess your skill set in this continuum, wherever you are. And then as a player coach team, we decide how we're going to work on taking your skill to the next level, be that from a beginner to intermediate. But the ultimate endpoint really is you want to have your skills at expert level. And if you have a large toolbox of skills that sit in that space, it gives you a greater opportunity of thriving, right? Because you've got more options when the time comes. And then the final one was obviously trying to understand what happens to you in performance when you are, given this stimulus. And then your natural reaction always is a reaction to it, and then understanding what happens next, like which way you're going to go. So we had it as red and green, and we were saying we want you to move to the green, and you respond. If you respond well, you're going to be in the green space. If you're not, you're in the red space, So, and we want to do our best to veer off there. And even if you spend your time momentarily in the red space, is understanding how you'd respond. So again, just trying to practically present to the guys so they could just understand it. And I remember when Adam put the model in front of me, it was obviously a diagram, and there were a lot of blocks and a lot of arrows. I was like, well, I don't understand that. So the players are going to struggle. Not to say that I've a better intellect than the players. It's just having studied, I probably thought that I've got a better chance of understanding it. So we just dedicated a session a week to just talk about this model, and we talk about it, and Adam would go away and sort of chunk it down and come back and go, okay, this is where I've got to. What do you reckon? I'd say, okay, visually it's not there yet. It's not simple enough. And we do it again until we eventually got to a model which for me was very simple, and most importantly, very easy to explain to the players. And so you had this thing which was the player, and then you had the environment. And obviously the player's responsibility was to become, to deliver on his high performance habits, to develop some real strong self-awareness. So what happens to me when it's in performance, and when I'm challenged, where do I go to? And then obviously the mental skills that help you deal with those moments, be it breathing, be it visualization, before whatever whatever that may be. And obviously Adam, with his skill set, was the guy there that would offer some advice as to what that potentially would look like. I think from a coaching point of view, the stuff that excited me was understanding the balance between challenge and support in the environment. So how do you challenge someone to help them grow their skill set, right? How do you challenge someone to put them in a position where they have to decide how they're going to respond in order to thrive? How do you challenge them to make them aware, like, look what happens here when you're in this space, you're in the thrive space here, and we want to move you out, and we want you to understand how you're going to move out, because when it comes to in game time, this is going to stand you in good stead. And then understanding that an environment that is challenging all the time is probably counterproductive, because then you start chipping away at confidence, you start chipping away at self-belief, and ultimately you really detract from performance. So if we could get the balance between challenge and support right, then what we would do is challenge, we would see growth, but then we'd support when needs be, so that we maintain self-confidence and self-belief of those players. So yeah, and in essence, like, there was an explicit presentation of that, but then there was also this understanding in the background of, for me, certainly as head coach, continually checking in and asking my staff to be real with me as to where are we at here with the challenge and support space of our environment. How do we challenge, and how do we challenge constructively? And are we doing too much challenging? Are we doing too much supporting? And that supporting that slows down growth. So really just trying to get that balance right now. I think that's the real nous of coaching. Well, part of it is that understanding, and just assessing and checking in and seeing where you stand. And if you get that right, I found that the rate of progression and growth is just exponential almost.
Oh, guys, where do we start here? How can we unpack this? This is awesome.
I have a couple of comments, actually. I'd like to chime in with Dan. And
Please.
It's amazing as you talk through there, Rob, remembering the amount of work that sort of went into revising that the model, the psychological model around response, reaction, thrive, survive. That was one part of it, and I guess I think about that as you read through any framework, concept, bit of psychological literature. That there is so much that goes into explaining human behaviour that you're right. The players don't need all of it, but they need the real crucial elements, and I think being able to work backwards and forwards through that was essential. There was also Rob's mentioned about integrating the players into the development of some of the concepts, not just the mental skills framework, but also the expert level skills. There was the other layer, Rob, of getting the leadership group on board, and we actually had a couple of days away with them in the winter, beginning to lay the foundation and to get there, to sense check with them whether it would land. So I guess the reason I say that is for perhaps coaches working with psychologists working with teams. There's a lot of background work and layering of communication to people within your team, within your organization, if you're going to get the alignment, the shared ownership, and the languaging to be really lived. And ultimately, that's what then brings it to life when you get together as a full staff. There was multi layers to it, and I don't know if we went into the project thinking about all those layers at the outset, but it certainly grew and developed as it went on.
Yeah, I've bashed my head many times, because you get excited by a concept or an idea, and you're so certain that it can work, and you just sort of bulldoze it into the environment because you're so excited about it, and then you can't understand when it doesn't land, and then there's this frustration, and we can talk definitely about EPG later, but there's this frustration around your excitement, and there's no excitement from the other side of the room, and so you learn over time that, again, this connection and the layering of it, and testing it, and creating an autonomy in the environment. Ultimately the environment is the players, and we're the gatekeepers of that environment. We're the ones that ensure that this ship keeps moving. But without the players, it's almost irrelevant, because it's not going to be worth anything. And so I've seen with different teams where you bring in a concept and you bring it in and it's yours. There's very little autonomy and ownership in that. And then when you say, listen, here's an idea, what do you guys reckon? Help us refine this. And this is your environment, so take take real care of it and take ownership to make this thing better, or tell us it's just not worth it and we'll throw it out the window. And then it starts to gather momentum.
Can I jump in there? Because I think you've started to, it's a neat segue to my first question, the initial question I thought about around your values. And I love the fact that you've packaged this. You've got the arrow, and if people listening in can use their powers of visualization here and image this in their mind, the arrow on the stem, you've got the values which spell out great: growth mindset, resilience, enjoyment, accountability, team first. And you mentioned, Rob, how in essence you whether it was pre-season or start of the season, you had each week there was a theme around each of these values, and you had players who would design the week around these themes. I mean, that feels the ultimate in being an autonomy supportive coach. And when I think about, you mentioned how you've been influenced historically by your experiences with Paddy Upton, for example. And I know Paddy briefly through, he came in, Eddie Jones invited him into England Rugby to spend a couple of days with us, and I enjoyed my time and the small talks that we had. And I know that he revolves so much of his work around being promoting this idea of autonomy supportive. So what I was going to ask you, Rob, is how comfortable you felt with your players designing weeks, because I know that would feel very out of the comfort zone of many coaches listening in. Any thoughts from you there?
Again, I suppose over time you develop trust,
Okay.
and you have a trust in your leadership group and your playing group. And I've seen it in different environments where the players don't actually accept responsibility for the environment, and then there's very little buy-in, there's very little contribution, and it feels like you're doing everything. But we had a certain group of guys that we connected with well enough to know that they valued the environment enough to actually make it worthwhile, and to buy into it. And obviously, given it was also the leader of the team at that point, it was his idea to dedicate the weeks to it. So it was this sort of symbiotic relationship where we would come up with certain amounts of the ideas, we would present on it, and then from the presentation we would then go. So we'd start the week off as a coaching staff and say, here's the concept of growth mindset. And then each day we would then hand over to the players after that, so Tuesday to Friday, to then start the day off with a story about growth mindset, or something from Instagram that spoke to them, or a personal reflection. And then that would lead into the day. And then the design of the day would obviously be largely driven by the coaching staff, but checking in with the leadership to say, this is what we're thinking of doing. What do you reckon? And then they would go, happy. Or what about if we just added this in? And so, I think you can't get away from the fact that the leader is the leader, the head coach is the head coach of the team. If you go back quickly to that idea of challenge and support, there's very few athletes, in my opinion, that I've come across that find the space to challenge themselves to a point where they grow themselves. There is a responsibility in the coaching space to be the person who provides the challenge, to shift the comfort zone, to ask the questions that make people want to move forward or become aware of areas that they need to move forward in. So it's it's a little bit of both, but again, coming back to relationships and trust, it's trusting that people believe in the environment and what you're trying to create enough to actually add significant value when it comes to them and their turn.
Coming to you, Adam, and building on what Rob's just said there. I mean, more and more in my consultancy practice, 20 years into, or nearly 20 years into being a sports psychology consultant, more and more, I completely agree. I find that changing behavior and promoting growth, development, and learning is, I'm not going to say impossible, but it's just made so much more difficult without players and coaches, but players taking ownership of these processes and of their game and of the practice in general. I think that's so crucial. And in sports psychology, of course, we talk about the importance of the environment. But for me, listening to you, listening to Rob, and thinking about all of my experiences and all my conversations with others Adam, I feel that it's so important for the environment to promote that sense of ownership through autonomy supportive coaching. Any thoughts, Adam?
Yeah, I'll go back to the original point I said. I guess if there's something that the players really sort of galvanise around, something to get excited, something that motivates them collectively as well as individually, because I guess all individuals will have a certain amount of motivation to get better. If that's the shared language amongst the team and that trust has been built over a period of time, no doubt it was actually a number of years, Rob, to the point that you got to with that group, there's an opportunity there to be able to support the players in developing some more choices about what they're going to do each week. And I guess the beauty of the autonomy supportive sort of definition is that, and people think it's just about choice. It's actually about choice within structure, isn't it? So the head coach is providing some options or some ideas or some concepts about how the week might run. And he's discussing with the athletes about what they might do. They then have some choice to say, yeah, okay, I think option A and option B are the way to go this week, depending on how the group are feeling and how we're seeing things. So they're getting some say in it. And as a result, that's creating more internalized motivation. That's what's going to drive them through some of those tougher moments in the week, through some of those tougher periods of form, through some of those tougher days when they're just off the pace, where their body isn't and their brain isn't quite firing as readily as it might do. Sometimes for good reason, sometimes for no apparent reason. But if you can involve them in the conversation, if they feel like they've genuinely got some say about where the ship's heading and the direction of the group, then that's likely to stand up more under pressure, under stress, when they're feeling fatigued.
Just coming to expert level skills, Rob, you unpacked that part of the model for us, that you'd have players and yourselves as coaches reflect on the level that a player is at with a specific skill, is what I heard, from beginner to intermediate to pro to expert. I suppose for some listening in, it might sound strange that a professional cricketer might view a certain skill at the intermediate level. So I don't think there's a question there necessarily, but I'd love to get a comment there. With that model, it feels like you're inviting in a degree of vulnerability from your players, that there could be an admittance of a lower skill level. So there's that to keep in mind. And then my other question for you is, when we think about autonomy supportive, and this might lean on your experience and qualifications in human movement, when you think about players going through those levels up to expert, how much autonomy supportive coaching is there? How much are you impressing on the player from a technical perspective? Do you feel, are you creating sessions where the technique is emerging from the session, or are you overtly coaching the technique, or is it sort of a mix of everything thrown in? I'd love you to unpack that for us, Rob, a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's definitely sort of a broad mixture of approaches. So just to relay the story, is I asked the bowling unit. So we were just talking about the simple, well, not simple. It's proved to be not very simple, but the executing a Yorker. So
Okay.
for a bowler to execute a Yorker,
What is a Yorker, just
a
briefly?
Yorker is the ball that lands basically at the batsman's feet. So to bowl that ball, if it's executed properly, is the hardest ball to score off. It's the hardest ball for a batsman to score runs off, right? So I asked the question, so as bowlers, how many balls would you execute perfectly out of 6 at expert level? And then they gave me 4 to 5 out of 6. Okay, so I said, fine. How many at professional level? They said, well, 3, roughly 3. So I said, okay, cool. And so we went through the layers. So I said, okay, well, you guys are at the professional level because you're getting paid to play cricket right now. So you're a professional. So essentially, he has the ball. You need to deliver 3 out of 6 Yorkers. And so none of them could do it, to cut a long story short. So I was like, okay, so we're actually professional cricketers that are delivering at intermediate level. What do we need to do? So it was a very easy example to then let the players show themselves. I didn't give them the numbers; they gave themselves the numbers, and said, "Okay, well, we've got some work to do here, because we're currently pro cricketers. Some of them were 1 out of 6, So you're at beginner level, by the way. So then we started to work at that, and I think then you move on to skill development, and as you said, it's vulnerable, but I suppose your coaching method is really critical, because if you're wanting someone to grow, there obviously has to be very, very little to no judgment. You know what I mean? You're exploring a skill. You're trying to figure out how to do something, and obviously as the coach, yes, there is some technical advice that you need to be on hand to give. I think the first part is exploration. So here's whatever it may be. So if you want to, I want you to hit the ball over there, okay? Because your stats tell me that when this type of bowler is bowling to you, you struggle to score, and the way to score is to hit the ball there. So let's just work on hitting the ball there. I won't tell you how just yet, but let's just give it a bash, and to then just explore, and help, and the player will start to figure it out. And then if they really aren't, you can say, what about this? What about that? Here's some technical, maybe you try this and whatever. And slowly you start to, but if we seem to get frustrated, or if we seem to judge, or whatever the case, then we're slowing the whole process down. I mean, we know that it sounds very obvious, but we often get it wrong. Is that, how will a player be encouraged to get better at something if he feels judged? You'll rather stay safe, right? Because then he's in survival mode, and he's not responding to get out. So it's just this multiple strategies that you're implying along the way, understanding the individual in front of you, and what part of challenge and support person do you need to be right now with this player in order for them to just keep chipping away at moving up these levels. And there's no one way. I think the way is actually just an awareness of all the ways, and understanding which way is going to be most beneficial for this player right now.
I love what you've done there. And recently we've spoken a lot about scaling on the Sports Psych show, and its powerful impact in the coaching process. That if you can help somebody scale where they feel they're at, yes, it might be a subjective measurement, but still it's a subjective measurement through the lens, through the eyes, in the world of the player. And I think that is so powerful. And then you've talked there about being, again, autonomy supported, but a multifaceted approach, whereby you can help a player be curious about developing the technique that they feel that they need to be to develop, but jump in with your own expertise. I mean, interested to come to you, Adam. I, as a sports psychologist, take a very broad definition of sports psychology. I think we could be quite greedy. I think, yes, it's important for us to stay in our lane, but I think we can reach out into other lanes and contribute. And I think we can do that in developing expert level skills. I think skill acquisition, the literature leans a lot on psychology, because it's about learning. And I think motor development, how do we learn motor skills, motor control, etc. Now, you have been a cricketer, you've been a cricket coach as well. So, and I draw on my experiences in golf, having been a pro golfer, having been a golf coach. When I was, say, for instance, lead psychologist for England Golf, I felt I had to be very, very careful, stay in my lane, lean over where I could into skill development, where was appropriate with the other coaches. So how do you as a sports psychologist lean over and contribute to skill development, but as a sports psychologist?
Yeah, this is a fascinating discussion, because I really think it comes down to role clarity or job specification. Because I guess depending on your training as a psychologist, whether you've been through a clinical program or if you've done a specialist sports psychology accreditation registration like there is in Britain, really depends on where your scope falls. And I guess if I thought with a more clinical end, it would be very easy for psychologists to stay in their office at the ground and see people one-to-one. But is that where the time's best spent? Well, it really comes to a question. What's the problem? So if someone's got a problem that needs addressed in a clinical capacity, then perhaps that's appropriate. But actually, most of the problems you're addressing are skill acquisition or performing under pressure problems. So that's really for you as the psychologist, as part of the discussions on contracting with the organisation or the team, as to what would you, here's what I can offer. What's going to fit your environment best? What are the types of problems that you're coming across most often? And yes, okay, there's some of the problems that I can help you address, and here's how I can do that. I can be in the nets with you, alongside you, listening to how you're working with a player, and, depending if appropriate, intervene with you and have a shared discussion, or we can discuss it after the session. So that was the first thought that came to mind. The next thought that came to mind when Rob was talking was the great thing about bowling, especially in relation to expert level skills, is it gave the players an opportunity to objectively measure where they were at based on their own scale, their subjective scale. It gave them a chance to test and test through the off-season and pre-season. So those guys who weren't getting any by the start of the season were getting at least a couple, probably more, I hope. Memory fails me there, but I'm sure they were getting at least a couple with Rob coaching them. And then you've got an opportunity to see if it stands up under pressure. So then, is it standing up in the middle? So when the bowler goes to bowl a Yorker in the middle, when it matters, when we need to save a boundary or whether we've got to defend a certain score, can they do it? So if then we see those skills breaking down the middle, as psychologists, we've got an opportunity to say, well, okay, we've seen them do that fairly regularly in the nets in training, but it's not standing up in the middle. Is this an opportunity now for a psychological intervention? So the opportunity then becomes, okay, well, who is best to deliver it? Because in many cases, the coaches can have that discussion around why the skill might be breaking down in the middle and be very, very helpful. Or is it best for the psychologist to do? So I probably haven't given you one answer there. It probably shows the nuance of both coaching and being a psychologist in a sporting environment. But the bottom line being the communication component, both at the start of the roles getting underway, but also as the work emerges.
I think, yeah, if I just jump in there, I mean, Adam will know that we discussed at length with various parties, what his role might be. Because for me, I saw a perfect opportunity for what I understood to be a performance coach, someone who understood the technical elements of cricket, but then had this background in sports psychology and a real strong understanding of that. So for me, this was a match made in heaven, really. But there was a real reluctance to allow him to step into that role for fear of, as you say, going out of your lane, breaking confidentiality and all these things, which I absolutely understand are critical. But we spoke at length about, at some point you also have to trust the individual to do their job, to understand the remit of the job, the scope of the job, where does confidentiality start and end. And at the end of the day, like, ultimately, how can I impress on performance here with these players? And I think there's an opportunity for us to just open our minds a little bit as to how the worlds can coexist, and where sports psychs can actually become really strong performance coaches if they're allowed, to live in the other world for a little while. Because remembering, going back to our players, they respond well to a practical application of theory. If you can show them how it works, how it looks, and how it feels, then you've got a far greater chance of impact than purely talking about, the theory behind it.
And just sorry, Dan, just to quickly to pull that together practically on the ground, as we thought about that model, like some of the best opportunities to impress on the players were the informal moments, and they weren't necessarily in-depth, confidential discussions specifically. They were very much performance discussions that allowed an opportunity to develop some of those skills that Rob talked about under what would allow you to thrive more often. Well, that was the high performance habits, so the behaviors that you engage in daily that allows you to show up in the best possible state to perform. Some mental skills, and again, psychologists would argue that there's varying levels of depth to this. The breathing, self-talk, relaxation is often the icing on the cake. I completely subscribe to that. But oftentimes those things can really help players unlock the next level of their performance. And then the self-awareness component. So, and coaches are engaging in this all the time. So how were you out there? How did it feel when that situation emerged, or when your skills were breaking down? What showed up? And those are often the embedding of the psychologist and being really clear on how they're going to impress on performance is a huge part of that discussion as more and more psychologists become integrated with sport.
I think it's a fascinating conversation, especially for sports psychologists in the world of sports psychology, because I think there's two things that we've spoken to so far on this episode related to embedding in sports psychology and a sports psychologist into a club or a team or an organization. And really it comes back to this word negotiation in many respects. I mean, Dr. Scott Goldman, brilliant American sports psychologist who's been on the show a few times now, relayed a story and he talked about it on the Sports Site show, so he won't mind me repeating this, that when he went in to speak to the Miami Dolphins, their owner there, or the GM, said, I know I want you, but I don't know why I want you and I don't know how I'm going to use you, type thing. And it feels like we've been stuck in that position for years as sports psychologists in many respects. How is sports psychology done? How do we deal with the challenges that emerge when sports psychologists work with teams? How do we embed this in appropriately? And there's a couple of things that both you gents have said, I think, which is really interesting, which is number one, being patient with the development of frameworks. Those frameworks are a negotiation between the sports psychologist and the coaching staff and the players themselves, who can have crucial input. So it's being patient with those frameworks and understanding that you can't just jump in week one, have the right framework, that they're going to take time and there's going to be some mistakes to begin with. And then the second thing is very much the negotiation of the role of the sports psychologist within the coaching practice, and what the sports psych is doing, and what that lane is, and how they lean over into the other lanes, and what the expertise is, and is this clinical practice, is this purely performance psychologist? Again, a negotiation. So I'm not really posing a question there. It's just making me think of the importance of this conversation for all those listening in. Whether you're a sports psych or whether you're somebody involved in a sporting organization who wants to use sports psychology, these kind of negotiations have to take place.
The main thing I'm thinking about here is for whether it's even coach and assistant coach working, or coach with psychologist, or the broader S&C nutritionist, all of the multidisciplinary team, the opportunity to have
it's an
regular conversations through the off-season period where you're doing your planning, where you can get clear on roles, responsibilities, scopes, the types of problems and grey areas that are going to crop up. But most importantly, your framework. If you call it a campaign plan, or the overarching framework, whether it's the mental skills, the conditioning, the way you're going to coach, or the way you're going to do your culture setup, those discussions are crucial, and they certainly can't be done over a cup of coffee and 1 hour. That's it's a thing that needs to grow and develop, and it takes time. Often time that people, I think, in my experience, underestimate. They try to cobble it together in the first week or the week before pre-season, and it requires a significant period of time.
I think there's so many avenues of involvement and impact, for the sports psych / performance coach. And I don't believe that we provide enough time for many of the avenues to be explored, right? So
Agreed.
your strength of your sports psychologist or performance coach is only as strong as the amount of time you provide from a visibility and presence point of view. If you, so like Adam says, a cup of coffee, that's not it. At the end of the day, like for me, it's a full immersion in the program. Because if I'm asking, to build on that, is I think there's a huge strength in the sports psychologist or performance coach with the actual coaching team. Huge benefit in, this is how we're trying to coach. Please observe and give me feedback. This is the language that we're trying to use. Please listen and give me feedback. This is how I want to come across as a coach. Please observe, give me feedback. And so this is the end point, and this is what we want to look at, what we want it to look like at the end. So again, give me feedback, tell me how we're going, and that when the environment is set and it's set strongly, then that person can easily come and say to me as the coach, I'll ask, how did that presentation go, or that team talk? And he can say to me, to be honest, I don't think you landed it. Okay, cool. Why not? Well, your language that you like to be with the team is A, and you use a lot of B, so that doesn't link up, and it's going to create confusion. So perfect. I'll be more aware of that next time round. So there's a real strength in that. I mean, in this last 50 over World Cup campaign, there was such a strong body of work done by our performance coach around our language, and just making sure that I can tend to start waffling, and instead of making 1 point, I bring a few extra in there just for good measure. And it's like you moved away from the single point that you're trying to make. Okay, so you diluted your conversation, then your team talk. I was like, okay, all right, need to be more aware, so be better at it. So. And if you're constantly having those conversations, I mean, your impact as a coach is just getting better and better and better. So that's the one aspect. And then if you think about players, and we're the same as coaches and just normal human beings, is that it's very difficult for someone who's hardly ever in the program to now come and start talking to you about your own performance. I mean, there needs to be some form of relationship for someone to observe me and go, hey, I think you were in survival mode there, bud. What was going on for you? And you're not going to go, you know what, you're right. I was experiencing A, B, and C, and you're just going to go, oh, okay, cool, and then that'll be it. So there's a real lack of understanding, I believe, lack of financial support in order to do this thing properly. And I guess we're all aiming for the same thing, but certainly an immersion in the program is almost a non-negotiable. I'd even go so far as to say you're better off not having it if you're going to be semi-involved, because you're never going to be able to make the impact that you'd want to anyway.
Sports psychologist contributing to coach development as well as coach education. Sports psychologist as critical friend. Sports psychologist as sense maker, or contributing to the sense making around coach behavior. I love it, and I think it's absolutely crucial. And if this was one of those podcasts that was 4 hours long, we'd be diving deeper into that side of things. But I want to be respectful of both your time. But I think there's so many things that we've left out there on the table that we can potentially unpack at a later date. So would love to extend an invite for you both to come back on, and we can talk more about this stuff and maybe reflect on how things have been going maybe over the next year or so. But I can't thank you, gents, enough for that conversation. Absolutely fascinating, and I love the frameworks that you created at Otago and the support you gave your players. Absolutely fantastic stuff. Adam, coming to you, how can people find you, follow you, and potentially get in touch?
Jeepers, I think I've been off the grid for a little while now, but I'm sure there's a Twitter account still out there somewhere, AJ Miles 19. You might find me, but that'll be about it.
Off the grid enough to not know that it's called X now rather than Twitter. But
yes.
And Rob, just briefly coming to you here, do you use social media at all? How can people find you if so?
I'm a terrible user of social media, to be dead honest. So I do have an Instagram account, but all you're going to see is pictures of sunsets and sunrises. So there might be the odd motivational quote here or there. So you'll find me on Wally's Tours if you wanted to. Wally's Tours on Instagram. But other than that, no. I try to steer away from those things as much as possible.
I don't blame you, and we all love a sunset, so you'll probably get a horde of new followers looking at your great pictures there. But I'm sure we can follow you as you lead the South African white ball team to a great deal of success. So, gents, thanks so much for today.
Pleasure, man. Thanks for the chat. It was cool. Very cool.
Thanks, Dan. It's been great.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast episode, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.